begin, I just wanted to say this is my own personal story. All the other brave veterans that came from Lakefield and did amazing things too. Everybody gave their bit. Plus, also those that gave a supreme sacrifice and lost their lives. But this is my own personal story. And I will forewarn you, if I break down crying, well, just ignore me. That sort of thing happens. As you can see, I am wearing my, the Air Force, well, it would be a shirt on most people. And I also have, which I could not keep on, what is called a sweetheart pin that was given to my mother by the, when Dad was in the Air Force, because it's in the shape of the wings. And I have that here if you would like to see that later. But we'll chat in the daylight when I'm done. Okay? Now, the topic is the 65th anniversary of VE Day in Holland. It was May the 5th, 1945, when the Canadians liberated Holland, and it was May the 8th, 1945, when victory in Europe was acclaimed. Now, the bravery and sacrifice of Canadian soldiers and airmen during that very hard-fought battle for the liberation of the Netherlands is really the stuff of legend. And because of that, eternal gratitude on the part of the people of the Netherlands. The never-ending affection for the liberating Canadians who freed them from the cruelty has been handed down from generation to generation. Near the town of Wageningen, near Arnhem, this was where the German generals signed the surrender of Denmark and the Netherlands. They surrendered the rest of Europe on May the 8th. The Netherlands were truly liberated and have never forgotten. The invasion of the Netherlands in May 1940 marked the beginning of 5 years of terror for the Dutch. They faced oppression and death with bravery, but nothing could save them from the hunger winter of 1944-45, when more than 30,000 of them died of starvation. So the Canadians gave the Dutch freedom and food, and out of such dark times, an eternal friendship was forged. Why am I interested? Well, I'm interested because of my parents. I was mainly a little twinkle in their eye. And when the war ended, my father, Bob McCracken, married my mother, Eileen Armstrong. They were married in Montreal, June the 12th, 1945. My mother was also an officer in the Air Force, as you can see from her uniform. She had an interesting career. She grew up in the Ottawa Valley in a little village of 400 people, and she trained as a nurse at Ottawa Civic. And when she had finished her training, she was asked by the United States ambassador to Brazil to be the private nurse in the U.S. Embassy in Brazil. So, coming from a village of 400 and having the joie de vivre, away she went on their private yacht with Bing Crosby and Bob Hope. And for the few years that she was down there, my aunt tells me she probably got engaged a few times because she brought home some lovely rings. Now, the only reason she returned was that the war was going to begin, and she did not, all the Canadians were called back, and she certainly didn't want to go and go back to her little village. So she was asked to start an emergency crash unit at an Air Force base that they were just beginning to build in Torbay, Newfoundland. And from that, my father, who joined when he was 20, joined the Air Force, he ended up doing some training at that Torbay Air Force Base, and that's how they met, because she was from the Ottawa Valley. Now, interesting, in her little logbook, there was a yearbook done as they built the Air Force Base there. By the way, that Torbay Air Force Base is now the Newfoundland St. John's Air Force Base, or St. John's base now. Next to her in the picture of the staff at the hospital was a Dr. Pilkey, who she'd never met before, and that was quite a surprise when Dr. Pilkey ended up moving to Lakefield. He was the brother of Gord Pilkey. Now you can see there I've shown a Royal Red Cross medal. My mother received the highest honor given through the Royal Red Cross during her time during the war, and it was for bravery. At this time, a lot of German U-boats were all along the coastline of Newfoundland, and a lot of our Air Force men lost their lives at that time, even stationed at that base. During a blizzard, she went out and headed a team to go out and rescue people that were hurt. So it was quite an honor for her to receive this, but well deserved. And she worked very hard while she was there. Now, my father joined the Air Force when he was still 19. He did his training in Ottawa, in Quebec, and finally at the Torbay Air Force Base when he learned to fly Hurricane, which they used to patrol along the coastline. From there, he went on to England, and that was, when he was at the Air Force Base in Newfoundland, it was the 128 wing. But when he continued on, he became part of the squadrons which were called the 400s, which were formed during the war. And his squadron was the 411. And from that, he joined a special unit, the 146 wing, that spent the entire winter of 1944-45 living in tents along the German-Dutch border through the winter. And they would, at this point, he became a Spitfire pilot. For those who are not familiar with Spitfires, it only holds one person, and it's cold in it, and it's totally surrounded in asbestos, and you had to be daring. And when I took a look at his logbook, he got reprimanded twice. First, for being overconfident. Well, I think you'd want to be overconfident to get up there in a Spitfire and start doing dogfights, personally. And also, when he came back down, he taxied so quickly at the base, he jammed into a lorry. Well, if any of you remember my dad driving around Lakefield in a blue truck, that wouldn't surprise you at all. Now, while he was doing his missions around March of 1945, when there was a really strong advancement into Germany, he was flying very low during the daytime with the Spitfire, flying over top of our troops that were advancing over the Rhine. Now, what happened was, as he did that, he saw in the German side a train that was filled with all kinds of equipment. So as he flew low to blow up the train, he was hit by flak from the train. His plane, 7,000 feet up, burst into flames. he parachuted out. And because of that and survived, he was given the caterpillar pin. Caterpillars represented the concept that they spun the silk. The silk was used to make parachutes. This caterpillar had red eyes to indicate that his plane blew up. Now, unfortunately for him, when that happened, he injured his leg when he got into, when he landed, parachuted, and he couldn't race into the woods fast enough, and where there was a German headquarters anyways. And when the officers there saw him, they were so infuriated because what the Spitfires had been doing recently was blowing up the planes that were already on the land in the German airfields. So they took it out in Dad, they knocked out his teeth, they beat him badly, they put in 9 days solitary confinement, and of course they took his ring and his watch and whatever else he had. And then from there on he was forced marched to carry the German equipment for days to a prisoner of war camp. And not only was he forced march, he had to carry all of their equipment, and as they would go through the villages, he was spit at. And that was his membership card, the Caterpillar Club. He was part of the 411 squadron called the Grizzly Bears. They thought that sounded really fierce and would scare everybody. Then he became part of the 126 wing. Now, this is the cover of a book, and this book I have on the table over there, and it tells about all the people in his squadron, and there's a little story about him in it too. Now, it's time for him to leave from Newfoundland, so he was given a bit of a break to come home. And his mother and father wanted a family photo taken because they didn't know what was going to happen next. Now, it looks like there's a tremendous difference in age between Dad, that is 20, and to the left, Dick, who is 10, and I'm proud to say Dick's son, Jeff McCracken, with his lovely wife, Karen, are here tonight. And then Dick's little brother, Jack, who was 5. Their father, Hilliard McCracken, had fought in World War I and direct descendant of McCracken's Landing. Now you'd wonder about the gap in the ages, because 5 years after Dad was born, there was a little girl called Bethel. Bethel lived until she was still 4, and she drowned in front of Hamlin's. So that's why there was that gap, and I do think Jack was supposed to be the little girl that was supposed to come. So you can imagine then the double worry that Grandma had. Was she going to lose another child? And Dick was losing his big idol brother, as was Jack. Now, the prisoner of war camp that Dad was at was called Stalag Luft 1. Luft is the short form for Luftwaffe, meaning Air Force. And it was in Barth, Germany, was northwest of Berlin, almost on the border to Denmark. The reason they placed that prisoner of war camp there was that the Allies would know that that's where it was, so they weren't going to destroy the town of Barth that was attached to it. That was sort of like a buffer protection for them. So luckily for Dad, even though it was bad treatment at that point, he was a prisoner of war from March 26th till May the 12th, and that was it. Notice it says May the 12th. That wasn't when they were to be freed. They were to have been freed 3 days earlier, but it was the job of the Russians to free that particular camp. And they were a wee bit late. I don't know how much vodka had to play in that. But as I said before, he got shot down when, by the heavy flak when he was strafing the enemy trains. And even though on April the 30th, 1945, after Hitler committed suicide, the German officers evacuated Stalag Luft 1. But there were 9,000 men in that camp, and you didn't want pandemonium happening. So it was up to then the men who were already in the camp to take over order. And some of them who spoke German ended up going out throughout the town of Barth, trying to find out where the Germans were. And at the same time, they were shocked to see how poorly the German town was. We suffered, but the regular German people did too. So they had to wait 3 more days after everybody else. And when he was freed, I actually see a video of it on YouTube. You see the men lining up and getting onto fortress planes. And Arnold Graham told me that he had flown over to bring some back. So he was brought back to England on May the 12th. Now, because they were waiting for the Germans, or the Russians to come, they had an underground newspaper, and you can see it's dated May the 5th. And this was the very last one they put out, saying, "Rusky, come! Where are you?" I have this newspaper, and that is very rare. I don't know how Dad got it folded up and kept it to get it home. This is only the front page of it there, and the back page, because it was on both sides of the paper, that shows the entrance gate into Barth, and that's the gate that Dad had to march through when he was the prisoner going to the camp. You know, one of the little sections says, "Where are the Russians?" You know, that sort of thing. So it was quite an interesting thing, because before that, the underground newspaper was passed around hut to hut, and then the last people had to totally destroy them then. Now, I'm starting my journey, and as I am only with Canadian veterans, I was so honored, and I traveled with them for 2 full weeks. It was set up by a company in Vancouver who advertised in the Legion magazine. And the first week, a lot of you heard my talk, and we did all the World War I sites. The second week, we traveled from Belgium all the way up to that part of Holland, Arnhem, right near the Rhine River, and see how close it is into Germany. And I have to thank Arnold Graham for telling me about that trip. And I tagged along with him during the second week when he came over. Here are the veterans with the families. These are the only people that went. All of the veterans and the family. We had enough for 3 bus loads. Now, 2 of the bus loads did the first week, and then the others. And there's Arnold, and Sally, and me, and son Paul there. And these were our 3 escorts. And this gentleman here, Ken McLeod, was hired by the tour company. He's a historian, a military historian, and he made some amazing contacts for us, as you're going to find out. And because I went on my own, I was able to interview every single one of them. This gentleman ended up working in the Pentagon, and this lady and her husband were in the Navy. So there were a lot of very interesting stories I was able to take from that. This picture was taken by the time we reached Arnhem, and that is what is called the John Frost Bridge, which was one of the saddest attempts by Montgomery to form an attack across the Rhine River to get into Germany. And it ended up with a book and a movie called A Bridge Too Far. And if you haven't seen that movie, I highly recommend it. And that is the viewpoint from prior to the war, when before the bridge and the advancement of the troops into Germany. And at this point, you can see that this is just prior to the war, where they're getting the equipment set up in Arnhem. It looks more peaceful now. Now, looking from the air along the Rhine River between Arnhem and over into the German side, there were several bridges. And by the time the Allies had advanced into the depths of Holland to cross over into Germany, there were these bridges that were going to be there. And the Germans at this point were retreating. And as a result, they were trying to destroy the bridges to prevent the Allies to advance. And only that one bridge that you saw our picture at that point was still standing. Now, our trip to do with where we're going to concentrate our visit is right up here at Arnhem. And from that, I'm going to tell you about Grosbeek, which is one of the major cemeteries, and Holton. And you can see the Rhine River, and you can also see where the German border is. These are the heaviest casualties so close to Germany that our allies, our Canadians, experienced. And then the big celebration at Apeldoorn that you would see on CBC radio. And that big parade and celebration was going to take place every 5 years. So our journey is going to begin in London, England, just like they would have in the beginning of World War II. So the two groups of the veterans I was with at this point, this is where we started off. And we had a celebration at the Imperial War Museum, which originally had been Bethlehem Hospital for the Insane. What a horrible name, because they just threw anybody in there that maybe had all kinds of emotional problems or post-traumatic stress. This was taken off a naval ship that had first commission in 1916 and went until the 40s. This one was used actually during D-Day. And inside, the ground floor gives you lots of room for all of the equipment. So, of course, I was interested in the Spitfire. And the engine of the Spitfire is a Rolls-Royce Merlin. Is that right? Merlin? Yeah. Merlin, that's right. And Mike, my able assistant here, God bless him, has had experience taking those apart and putting them together. And the famous quote, which has been misquoted many times by Churchill, never was so much owed by so many to so few. And we are going to take off, not by the tunnel, we're going to take off as they did, but in a calmer way, from Dover. And as Vera Lynn says, the White Cliffs of Dover. We ended in France at Calais. And the first cemetery that we came to was the Canadian War Cemetery. All along there is the Atlantic Wall that was built with high fortifications by the Germans. And this was a terrible area for conflict because the Allies really needed supplies and equipment and food. and the Germans were blocking all the entrances of the ports so that they hoped to starve out the Allies so they couldn't continue on with the war. So there were a lot of lives lost. It's very peaceful there now in Belgium. But even as the farming continues along there, there's lots of artifacts that are still found. Even digging down to find tunnels and still perhaps some, hopefully not active shrapnel and things. Now here, to me, was the most interesting place to visit. This is in Belgium, and it's near a town called Adegem. Now, this is the history of a very famous secret underground service gentleman. He was doing both sides in the sense that in the town, because it was German occupied, he would become friends with the Germans and get as much information as he could. And then he would pass it on to the Allies. And at night, he would go out when planes were shot down and rescue, along with his team, the Canadian and Polish airmen that were shot down. But he got to be known by the Germans, and they were furious. He had to go underground and eventually be protected by the Canadian and Polish. His family had no idea, but literally on his deathbed, he revealed the secret, and he made them promise, his son promised, to set up a museum that honored just the Canadian and the Polish. And this is the museum. From the air, it's a combination of the maple leaf and the Polish with the two-sided bird. Now, this is a garden of meditation, and it's very peaceful there. This does not look big from the air, but when you go in, it's just like it just goes on and on and on. Huge. This is the son. He has received every honor possible of Belgium. He's the owner. He followed his father's wishes. And one level of the museum is made up of miniatures. And they're made to scale. They are absolutely accurate. And it depicts all the battles that took place in all that area around Belgium. Even to the details that you would find a woman standing with a can of milk to give to the troops when they went by. But at this point, it was occupied by the Germans. The other thing he was able to do, this gentleman that owns it now, he was able to acquire every single bit of equipment that was used by all the Canadian and Polish allies. It was remarkable, but some was on loan, some was actually given to them. And this section is not the miniatures, these are true-to-life size mannequins. And I want you to just focus in on that face. And in this next one, this face here, and of course the Canadian paratroopers. If you had a World War II family member that fought in that area, you were to send in a photograph of them. These mannequins are the faces of all the men whose photos were sent in. They weren't just put together. I was quite interested in the area to do with the Air Force because he was so appreciative. And people understand why they had the big wide boots, because they'd have, if you're sitting in a Spitfire and you don't have that much room, you've got maps in there, you've got everything under the sun. And something that I'll point out later after is in their uniforms, one of their buttons, the material comes off and it's a compass. I have one of Dad's buttons that has come apart, and I can show you, if you wish to see it at some point, the compass that was part of it. Now, this was quite interesting because just a couple of weeks before, they found this raft, and we were there just 5 years ago. They found this raft still in the mud and in the reeds, and the remains of skeleton of one of the Air Force men. And so what they did was they had just put the raft back on display. This is just to keep everything together. And then they put the mannequin to show what he would have looked like after he had landed. Now, he has set up the museum, the main part, to be very peaceful and reflective. So he has done it where the stained glass are made up of every different unit and their badges. And this is what was called the tea room. But I just want to tell you how clever he was. He built this tea room with two different symbols, and I'm going to explain. The first symbol was the symbolism of faith. There was one huge, large oak cross as the main heavy beam in the ceiling to resemble the cross. Then there are 12 equal semi-freestone columns to represent the 12 apostles. There's three full bluestone pillars to represent the Holy Trinity, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. And then there's 4 Gothic windows to represent the 4 evangelists. And there's 1 bar, and that's to represent the Old Communion. Now, the decor behind the bar is an actual rood screen from a church. Now, the other symbolism which they worked in was the year actually that the war ended. The large oak cross formed by the 4 heavy beams is the 4 seasons. The 12 equal half bluestone columns, the 12 months in 1 year, 52 cross beams, 52 weeks in 1 year, 366 small bars. Did you hear me say 366? Because 366 days in the leap year, which was 1944, the year that the liberation was a leap year. And there's a huge painting of poppies in behind. This man, a part of our group, is Major Dickinson, and he ended up after the war becoming a Supreme Court judge. Now, just in that town, there is a Canadian War cemetery, and out of all those burials, 848 were Canadians. And this is the entrance. And we have some of the Belgian military joining us for a service. We were so lucky with this group. We had our own piper. He was from Ottawa, and he's wearing his grandfather's World War I jacket. This is a native veteran from Alberta, and we have the Belgian here. And so we were having our ceremony. I like this picture because it's a different we've got the grandfather, the grandson, and here is a current Belgian soldier, and they're exchanging pins. It shows that the youth will remember. And what they did in the town was they had an amazing collection of World War II equipment to show us. I don't know. She was hooking a ride somewhere. I could have given that jacket up so many times. Now, we're walking to the ceremony. This man is from Alberta. He is referred to now as Father Green. But it was very moving for him because he was in control of a tank that came through this village and saved the people. And he broke down in tears when he told us that those people were starving, there were no homes left, and a lady ran out with one fresh egg and gave it to him. Her family had nothing. So we're having our own ceremony there, and local people joined us. And that would be the Belgian band. Now we're coming to an area that became very famous in the fall of 1944. They thought for sure that this would end up helping the war end faster. The thing was, this Leopold Canal leads to Antwerp. Antwerp was the main port by the sea, and along the waters there were 250 Allied ships waiting to come along with supplies that the Allies badly needed. But the Germans were controlling that port. It was important that the Allies get across this canal. Just a second here. This side of the canal were the Germans. This side were the Allies. That doesn't look very big, but you got to get across, and you got to get your equipment across. And if they can get across and be successful, they can continue down the way to Antwerp to open up that port and get the badly needed supplies. And my wonderful assistant, Mike Stedman here, pointed out to me that those trees, the concept started from Napoleon. He used that idea in his battles because it protected them from the enemy, because the enemy couldn't see them. And that's what the Germans did too. So I'm walking along here with one of the veterans who lives in Toronto, and he was telling me that he was on a tank, an open tank, and his two best buddies were on either side of him. And bang, out behind the trees, 2 shots, and both of his buddies were killed. And he's the only one left on the tank. These 2 men were part of that battle. And they were just reliving what they did and how they were going to win that particular battle. While we were there, some of the they were still digging up some of the things found, and also some of the things still found from World War I. So they put them out in display for us. You can imagine what happened to whoever had that on. Now, the biggest surprise was when they were trying to cross the canal. They didn't realize that these bunkers were built right in there, these pillboxes. And as they were crossing, as the Allies attempted to cross, then all of a sudden the Germans had this in their sights and would shoot as they came out, because they were built right into the ground there. We didn't have any flashlights, so I had a camera that way, and every time it would light up, our poor Piper wondered whether I was just trying to take a whole bunch of pictures of him. Well, maybe I was. And so that just shows you how deeply they were down and on the German side. This particular day happened only because our tour group and the military consultant that came with us had a connection with the mayor of Katwijk. Katwijk is a town by the sea of about 60,000 people. So on May the 5th, the day of the liberation, we were invited by the mayor to take part in their special 65th anniversary festivities. This town was heavily, well, it was practically destroyed in 1943 because Hitler was still constructing the Atlantic Wall and needed any of the equipment he could find. Now, as you can see, it's by the sea, and we were just amazed. Even though there's 60,000 people, they said there were that day between 200 and 300,000 people. They knew we were coming, plus it was a really, I mean, this was the 65th anniversary of VE Day for them. And one of the inhabitants there became Winston Churchill, and he had his equipment there saying Winston Churchill, and he waved at us when we went by. But the people were so respectful, they let us get by. They were just everywhere. But they very quietly and just parted. People were waving from everywhere as we came along. And this is near the viewing stand, but before we became part of the parade, we were invited to the museum there to have a lunch. And it was great fun because the people that were going to serve us were dressed in traditional costumes. Now, I was just overwhelmed. People knew that I was there to research about my dad, and I knew that he was doing extra missions with the RAF. So they asked me to meet with this RAF squadron leader, Tony Iveson. He was a Spitfire pilot at the Battle of Britain, and after that he became part of the 617 Dam Busters, and they also did a lot in Denmark with that. And he was also prisoner of war of the Great Escape. This is a very famous man. There are all kinds of documentaries about him in England, and he is extremely well respected. He did pass away 2 years ago, and there were all kinds of who's who from England that attended his funeral. And when I told him that Dad was part of the wing that he was at, and it was near Arnhem, he said, "Well, you're lucky your dad ever survived that." So I had a newspaper article that had been in a local paper here, and we were discussing that. And once we'd had our lunch, we were going to march to the viewing stand and be the only ones there with the mayor of Katwijk. They started the parade with their Belgian band, and you can see this is an open bus for the veterans that felt that they couldn't walk all the way to the viewing stand, and some of us just walked behind. But people everywhere were greeting us and clapping as they went by. And all the veterans at this point then got to walk and march just a few steps further into the viewing stand. This is our military consultant that came with us. And here's Arnold. So proud of you, Arnold. Now, compare it to 65 years ago. There's the troops going through the exact same spot. So, we are now on the viewing stand. Here is the mayor, and the parade begins. I'm here. Arnold's up here, close up front. And these are the organizers of the parade. So they had all kinds of interesting equipment. This was to depict that a lot of the Jewish people were hidden by the Dutch, and just like the idea of Anne Frank. So this would be the outside of a store, this would be the storefront, and hidden behind all the walls, whatever, would be one of the Jewish families. Now, this was taken at the reception that we had for the dinner that they served us. And this is the couple, the husband and wife who'd been part of the Navy. He showed us photos of his ship as they were getting to Dieppe, and it was totally covered in ice. Extremely interesting stories. We went to the most beautiful reception community hall that they had for Catwick. The mayor was then going to present all of our vets, those 3 groups, with a special honor. And our groups and family joined in here. Now, these were the only ones that were not our vets. These 4, along with Tony Iveson that I showed you, were from England. They came over to thank a Dutch family who owned a farm. And one of the planes of the Allies was shot down, and the Dutch family tried to go out to save them. And all the men in the plane had a whistle just to show that they were alive, and the Dutch family could hear this whistle blowing and blowing, but they could not go out because they were surrounded by the Germans. So eventually the whistling stopped and they all died. But the Dutch family built a beautiful little cemetery plot in their farmland and have had their generations look after it. So these men came over to give them a special award. This man and Tony Iveson were part of the Great Escape, and what they did at the age of 90 was they wanted to rebuild the hut where the Great Escape took place. So they did the first 2 days of the walk, meaning after the Germans found out about the Great Escape, they were so furious, they shut down that prisoner of war camp, and they force marched them in the winter to another camp. The first night they slept in a rundown barn. This man and Tony Iveson redid that walk for the first 2 days, raised enough money to rebuild that hut, Harry, which is now in part of Poland. Remarkable. There you are, Arnold. And this was the medal that they were all receiving from the mayor. And we were treated so royally there with whatever you wanted, even orange juice. And it was fun. The German people just were so happy to see the veterans that it was a time to celebrate. And they're all dancing, and oh, it just made you feel so good. Now, this is when I felt extremely humble. I'm walking just the way you see me there. I'm there just to learn about my dad. I'm not one of the brave vets. This lady, who did not speak English, was starving to death during that time, that before they were liberated. She remembers the Air Force dropping down food for them. And when she saw my outfit, she insisted on having a picture with me. Her family had somebody take a family picture, and I thought, I didn't do this. It's everybody else. But that's how much it meant to them. The younger children spoke English, and they said, Grandma says, thank you also to your Father in heaven. Now, we visited a grave site in Germany that was just over the border. And Arnold spoke, and spoke very well. This was where a lot of the Canadian Air Force men were buried. And Arnold was the first one on a mission to shoot down one of the German planes, which were a new kind of plane that they were not prepared for. They just came out of nowhere and they didn't know what was happening. And Arnold, being a gunner, that meant he was at the end of the plane in full view. And we were very proud of what he did. And he spoke to us about that. Whoops. So it's the largest World War II Commonwealth cemetery in Germany, including 708 Canadian airmen. If you have a cemetery in a different country, that is claimed as Canadian land and looked after by the Canadians. Now, we went to visit another place in Germany called Vienne. Oh, Krista can help me with that. But it was a terrible battle there, March the 25th, close to when Dad was shot down, actually. And Major Dixon, that I showed you earlier from Nova Scotia, who became a Supreme Court judge, he was leading the attack and was heavily wounded. In fact, the bullets went right through his ribs, through his liver, and through 2 other organs, and he darn near died. But I mean, he did very well, didn't he, to get back and then go to university and become a lawyer and a judge. But there were 90 German soldiers lost there, 51 British, 40 Canadians. So he went back there in 2000, and he had this plaque put up to recall that battle and all the people that died in that battle. It's placed next to this church, and we sat in that church, and the mayor of this German town spoke to us. On behalf of the German people, she said, we apologize, but also we suffered too. And they did. And during that time we were there, again, it was very moving because our piper played. I mean, the whole thing was a trip of tears, but it's so emotional. Now, here we go to one of the largest cemeteries in Holland, Groesbeek. And you can see it's large. The ruling was that when these cemeteries were built after the war, that if there was a certain number of grave sites there, they were allowed to have what was called, it looked like a sarcophagus, and then the inverted sword, the sacrifice, depending on the side. And these here, you would walk into these and there would be books that would have the list of everybody there, and you could find where a certain gravesite was. Now, because this is while they're trying to enter into Germany, you can see how many Canadians were killed there. And this is all in the area. This is Nyman, but it's all in the area of Arnhem. And it's all written up in my dad's logbook, too, about the places that he was protecting. So this was an entrance for any of the large ones. Their name liveth forevermore. That statement was decided by a committee in England, and that was decided by Rudyard Kipling. So we're going to go into that. There was that cemetery, Arnold and his son Paul and Sally. Paul and Sally just stayed with us a few days, but this is one of the days they were with us. And we found the gravesite of a very brave soldier from Lakefield, Sergeant Sherman Hill, 12th of February, 1945. And you can see that it says the Stormont Dundas and Glengarry Highlanders. Very brave man, leaving behind a family. His name is on the cenotaph. Now, I do have to tell you a funny story from his son Lance. When my dad was doing his last